After the tragic events of September 11, 2001, sadly what we have seen is democratic governments who claim to be promoters of democracy have actually violated certain fundamental tenets of democracy. What we have seen in the name of the so-called war on terror has been a curtailment of civil liberties, racial and religious profiling. Now, it's important to recognize that over the last 10 years, we've seen a shrinking of democratic space for not only environmental activists, but for a range of other activists working for social justice issues and so on. But it's important to recognize that it's all of civil society, trade unionists, NGOs, even faith leaders, religious leaders who have stood up for various causes of justice that have actually paid a price for their resistance. And all of this, at the end of the day, is to frustrate the attempts of environmental activists to actually speak truth to power and to say what is actually happening in the world right now. And what is happening is that politicians and CEOs of big companies know that time is running out, know that in fact the science is clear, and they are so strangulated by short-term political and economic interests that they are not willing to look at what we are doing to our children and grandchildren's future. But what those governments that are engaged in this need to understand, and I can speak from my experience as a young anti-apartheid activist, that when governments seek to be repressive, when governments shrink democratic space, they have two results. One is they force people underground and out of the public space, and which is not healthy for democracy on the one hand. On the other hand, it actually strengthens the resolve of activists to actually stand up and fight. And if governments who engage in repression think that they are actually intimidating those that seek to speak for environmental justice, then they got it completely wrong. Albert Einstein once said, "Dissent is the highest form of patriotism." And it's important to learn from history as well. What does history teach us? When humanity has been confronted by a major struggle or a major injustice, whether it was slavery, whether it was colonialism, a woman's right to vote, civil rights in the United States, apartheid, and so on, it was only when decent men and women stepped up and said, enough is enough and no more. We are prepared to go to prison if necessary. We are prepared to give our lives if necessary. So it's very important that we recognize when history looks back at this moment, the folks that are standing up to address climate change and address other environmental disasters and crime that we are facing, history will look back 20 years from now and say those were the real heroes of the moment. Those are the ones who had it right. Let's be blunt about it. The real criminals here are those with power in government and the business sector who are engaged in mass-scale corruption, mass-scale environmental crimes, and who act with absolute impunity and get away with it. On the other hand, at Greenpeace, what we are finding is that the number of activists that are facing trial, the amount of legal suits that are being brought against us is growing astronomically. I mean, right now, as I speak to you, we have about 10 million euros in claims against us for various actions that we've taken to highlight, the threat of climate change. These are actions being brought by companies which are seeking to silence resistance to them. The time has come for us to resist in the strongest possible ways, peacefully, but not necessarily complying to all the restrictive legislation that governments have put in place that in fact restrict democracy. Part of the repression that we are seeing in the shrinking of democratic space is to send a message to the average citizen, forget it, stay at home, make love, enjoy whatever you enjoy. You can talk out, but you're not going to make a difference. We must refuse to accept that the voices of ordinary people do not make a difference, because indeed it's the voices of ordinary people throughout history that actually made history move forward away from slavery, away from apartheid, away from colonialism, and so on. when you use those methods of detention without trial, clamping down on peaceful protests and so on, there comes a time when, in fact, people say enough is enough and no more, and the very governance system will get challenged, which is, I think, a likely outcome if this trend of shrinking of democratic space continues.